China and Nigeria have long been friends since the establishment of their diplomatic ties in the 1970s. But now that relationship is more profitable for both sides. China and Nigeria's bilateral trade rose to more than $13 billion last year from around $2 billion a decade ago. Nigeria's president is in China this week discussing how to expand that relationship further. CCTV's Han Peng is here from Beijing with the latest. And Peng, what are the biggest deals that have come out of President Buhari's visit?
Well, Anand, there are two most important deals signed during President Buhari's visit in China. First is China's $6 billion loan to Nigeria, and second is Nigeria's agreement to become the first African country to include Chinese yuan currency in its foreign reserves. This comes because Nigeria is facing shrinking US dollar reserves because of the plunging oil prices. The country is the biggest oil exporter in Africa. Besides, the two countries also signed deals on industrial activity, aviation, and infrastructure investment cooperation. By doing this, Nigeria hopes to reduce its heavy reliance on oil export for revenue and expand its development of industries into other areas. The opportunities for more bilateral cooperation, as President Buhari described, are virtually limitless.
Peng, how does China view its relationship with Nigeria?
Well, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lu Kang calls Nigeria an important strategic partner for China in Africa. Nigeria is ranked #1 on the continent, not just in terms of the size of its economy, which is now nearly twice the size of South Africa, but it is also the most populous nation and the biggest oil exporter in Africa. Since the two countries established their diplomatic relations 45 years ago, China and Nigeria have maintained frequent high-level exchanges. And now, as China is expanding its presence in Africa, many believe that maintaining close relations with Nigeria is becoming increasingly crucial for Beijing.
And how will this economic relationship between China and Nigeria boost the African continent as a whole?
Nigeria's leading role in Africa makes its cooperation with China an example for many other countries in Africa. As President Buhari said, despite being the largest economy in Africa, Nigeria is still badly in need of many projects China has the capacity to undertake. These include connecting the much-needed roads and railways, not just inside Nigeria, but also with its neighboring countries in Africa. Besides, like many other African countries, Nigeria now earns foreign reserves mostly from the exportation of resources and then spend this money heavily on imports of food, a model Africa is struggling to get rid of. As China is seeking to invest overseas in fields like agriculture and manufacturing, it is in a good position to carry out mutually beneficial cooperation with African nations. Back to you, Anand.
Thanks, Peng. That's CCTV's Han Peng reporting from Beijing. Joining us now to analyze the state visit from Nairobi, Lu Jinghao is a project director at the Sino Africa Center of Excellence Foundation. From Johannesburg, Bob Wekesa is a post-doctoral fellow researching Africa-China affairs at the University of the Witwatersrand. And Deborah Brautigam is director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Deborah, so we have President Buhari going to China. What will his priorities be? What does he hope to get out of this?
I think President Buhari has two priorities right now, and the first is security. They're dealing with Boko Haram, an insurgent group up in the north. We've all heard about the kidnappings that have happened over the past few years. So that's a pretty serious problem for him. And the second problem is his economy. With the price of oil plunging, their revenues have plunged. He has a big deficit to make up in his budget. It's about $11 billion. So he's looking for ways to plug that gap. So those two areas are ones in which he's been discussing partnering with China.
Right, Jinghao, let's talk about the economy and the economic relationship between Nigeria and China. Nigeria is one of the world's major oil producers, and as Deborah just pointed out, oil prices are dropping significantly. How does China help Nigeria with this?
Yeah, currently we're looking at the Chinese trade with Nigeria growing almost 700% in the last 10 years. And China is being one of the largest exporter to Nigerian market in terms of manufactured goods, but at the same time importing oil from Nigeria. So at this moment when Nigerian oil market is in trouble, in fact, China is continuously promoting projects that is going to help with the growth. So President Buhari mentioned a lot of times that at the moment, Chinese financing and infrastructure projects will help Nigeria transform its economy and slowly diversify its economy. And in this process, Chinese financing and Chinese construction companies will play a very important role. And I think this meeting with President Xi Jinping is very important.
Bob, what is the nature of this relationship between China and Nigeria? It's a strategic partnership, as we know, but how would you characterize the relationship?
Right. The relationship was actually designated, as you rightly put it, as a strategic partnership. And the essence of a strategic partnership is that it's not just a partnership, it's beyond political considerations and bilateral relations alone, goes into issues to do with cultural considerations, political and indeed geopolitical considerations, as it were. And I think this rides on the fact that Nigeria, as well known, I mean, it's a fact that everybody knows, is Nigeria is the biggest African country in terms of population, and recently, after rebasing of its economy in 2014, also the biggest economy by GDP on the continent. In fact, as it is, the relations between China and Nigeria are second only to South African ones in terms of, for example, foreign direct investments from one country to the other. And therefore, yeah, the strategic partnership is such that when the President Buhari visits China, it is perhaps to recast the relations in the context of current dynamics, which Professor Deborah Brautigam mentioned at the beginning of the show.
Deborah, we hear so many descriptions about this relationship between China and Africa. You know, one prevailing view is that China is in Africa merely to go after its commodities, to plunder the continent's commodities. Is there evidence to support this?
Certainly, commodities and resources are a very attractive part of the relationship for China. But an underplayed aspect of this relationship is the size of Africa as a construction market. Of course, it's a market for goods and materials coming from China, finished products. But the construction business in Africa is really large, and Chinese companies have been locking up a lot of that business, about $50 billion worth of revenues per year. And that's not all financed by China. I would say 20 or 25% of that comes from Chinese loans, but the rest of that is a variety of funding sources. So the Chinese companies are really rebuilding Africa, and this is a very attractive part of that relationship.
It's not just construction, though, is it? The Chinese are also involved in the services sector?
There's a lot of different involvement. The services sector is basically in finance. One big investment with Standard Bank and ICBC, about 20% of Standard Bank, ICBC bought that in 2008, and they've been partnering on various project finance operations around the continent. Aside from that, really construction is the major sector, and that's not so much investment. It's much more just doing the projects as turnkey projects. And there's been very little investment in terms of build, operate, transfer kinds of projects.
Right, Jinghao, China, of course, can invest its money anywhere in the world, but it has singled out Africa for so much investment. We see that in Nigeria right now. Why a big focus on African countries like Nigeria?
So I think at the moment, when we're looking at Chinese economy, we realize that a lot of Chinese manufacturers are facing with increasing labor cost and saturated market in China. So the first place they will seek to go global is places where they can find a relatively cheaper labor cost and also like with abundant natural resources to manufacture and also with favorable policy. So in all these three areas, African countries, especially the countries that have a very sustainable relationship with China, has revealed a lot of opportunities. So these days, Chinese promoting the One Belt, One Road policy is encouraging a lot of Chinese companies to set up factories and operations all over the continent. So it's about for the companies themselves to choose where they operate. In terms of Nigeria, this market has revealed a huge potential because it's large population and it's huge market for construction and all the related fields. And that is very attractive to many traditional Chinese manufacturers along the Chinese coast these days looking to enter the global market.
Bob, China's bilateral trade with Nigeria has grown from $2 billion in 2002 to $13 billion last year. What are the economic sectors that are driving this kind of growth? And is it very much an equal partnership?
No, of course, oil is the big one, is the major source of the trade. And essentially, the export of Nigerian oil to China has been, playing a huge role in the growing figures of, export amounts of money. And essentially, this has been because also, the U.S., which used to be a major importer of Nigerian crude, kind of went slow on buying from Nigeria, essentially because the U.S. discovered its own shale oil and it's been started processing and using that. So the bigger portion or chunk of the trade relations will be based on oil. But also equally big is the importation of manufactured goods from China to Nigeria. And this is not just by Nigerian entrepreneurs or Nigerian manufacturers. It's also a huge number of Nigerian entrepreneurs who go all the way to various parts of China, particularly Guangzhou and Yiwu, to procure products as wide-ranging as clothes and shoes, to light machinery, to farm implements and equipment and so forth, and then take them into the Nigerian market. It has been commented on over and over that the deficit is in the disfavor of Nigeria and in the favor of China in terms of the trade deficits. And therefore, that's the position, perhaps one of the issues that will be on the table for discussion.
Deborah, you've written a lot about this relationship between China and Africa. You've written about some of the myths that exist about China in Africa. What are some of those myths and how do they come about?
Oh, my most recent book looks at the land grab myth. And that, I think the conventional wisdom is that the Chinese have acquired large amounts of land in Africa. And this is being led by the Chinese government, and the purpose is to grow food to send back to China, and they're sending Chinese farmers to do that. So I have a new book out in which I spent 3 years looking into this with a lot of field work, a team of people. And we found that there's actually very little land that's been acquired for agriculture, and the Chinese government is not leading it. In fact, companies that are interested in investing in agriculture complain all the time that they're not getting support from the Chinese government. And the purpose of the investments that are happening is about commodities. So it's about cotton, it's about rubber, it's about sisal, it's even about raw sugar, and that's being sent to Europe. And Chinese farmers are not coming over to grow these commodities either. So I think that these kinds of myths tend to circulate. They get stated, and then people circulate them without really checking for the evidence.